Okay, so our first article in the Around the Internet section is talking about Bryan Johnson and his routine. And like we said a few times earlier, I think he's a marketing genius. He's really inhabited the consciousness of many different health people. And I think it's because, like we all know in the health world, like extremes really attract people. And he's really taken biohacking to another level, way more so than his peers. And so what is there to learn about Bryan Johnson? What can we extract from him?
I would say that the first thing that I see, because I've had quite a few clients and people reach out to me and ask me, what do I think about what he's doing? The first thing that I see is I don't see this as very practical for like the average person, right? In terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of energy, to go about and do all of these different things is a huge lift. And I feel like most people won't be able to do this. So even if this was the best way to go, which we're going to make arguments is against that idea, it's just not practical to implement. And so a lot of times, like if I'm working with somebody, the first question that I'm actually thinking about is not what is the best plan. It's what is the plan that is implementable? Because if you can't follow something, then it doesn't matter what you have written on paper or anything along those lines. And this is just, this is another level. The amount of testing, the amount of supplements, how things are prepared, like it's really and attention to some of the details. Are some of the things great, like the super low heavy metal organic chocolate or like the really high quality olive oil? Yeah, those things, that attention to detail, all of that is great. But some of the other components are like, I think, very difficult for the common person. And not saying that I'm not trying to strong man Bryan Johnson here and say that he was trying to promote it to that perspective, because that's not his ultimate goal. But just like when people ask me or when clients ask me, it's like, even if this was the best thing, it's not something that could be implementable. The other thing I want to say is, well, I think there's some things that are in his paradigm or his setup here that are quite ridiculous from like a logical perspective, not from a judgmental perspective, or from like my understanding of the research. I think that there's some things that are also, I think, are fine. And I think that are like not that problematic to do on a regular basis, or a supplement, or some of the foods that really aren't that bad and are likely beneficial. So I do want to frame it that way. It's not like every single thing he's doing is bad or is just completely counter to some of the things within the bioenergetic sphere. It's more of like a mixed bag of things, and some are like really counter to the ideas, and then some are not really that far off. So it just really we're only going to cover diet and supplements here, and we'll get into it, but we can't get into everything else. We don't want to spend 2 hours just on that. But I want to put that frame there so that it's not all of this stuff is bad automatically. That's not what I'm saying. I don't think that's what either of you guys are saying either, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Before we get into his diet and supplements, he has some mixture of philosophy surrounding the rate of living theory. And so I think that's important to understand, because the rate of living stuff is the polar opposite of the bioenergetic stuff. Like the elevator pitch for the bioenergetic stuff is mimicking the metabolism of a child. And he's like mimicking the metabolism of like an aging old adult. And so
like that Greenland shark, right? That's like, has like super low body temperature and lives like 400 years old or something.
Exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Okay, Jay.
And just talking about the reason why it's such a mixed bag is because his routine and his perspective is a conglomeration of different reductionist ideas. I mean, that's essentially what biohacking is you see this study that shows this compound providing this benefit. So you use that. And then you see this other study or this other conglomeration of studies showing this modality that provides this benefit. And you just throw them all together. And there's no unifying theory. There's no larger context of physiology. And with that, it's really hard to delineate what is accurate and what's not accurate. And so you end up with a hodgepodge of ideas and modalities. And we'll dig into, of course, where some of our disagreements are with this and how a lot of them do conflict with the bioenergetic view. So I think that's important to consider as well, is the lack of larger cohesive perspective. And that's how you get stuck in the rabbit hole of using resveratrol because of David Sinclair's research, which then turned out to really not be valid at all. You know, you end up, or how you end up using estrogen despite the 70 plus years of it failing as a successful, or failing as a medication or as a drug to provide any benefit. So we'll dig into all those things, but I think that's an important larger perspective. The last thing I want to mention before we dig into the details is just as a disclaimer, when we're talking about anybody else's perspective here, we're always doing this trying to do this in a constructive way to describe our disagreements or agreements with what their perspective is or what's being shared. And we're always happy to have these people on, discuss these things with them, and ideally have a productive discussion in that way too. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well.
Got it. Good.
Yeah, as long as they're not disrespectful. We don't want a repeat of the Randall cycle situation.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't care if people call us names. Maybe that makes for a good show too.
I mean, I call you guys a lot of names, so yeah.
That's true. People knew what you said about us when we were off air, Danny.
That's true. I'm like a tyrant with podcasting. Okay, so let me throw some numbers at you guys. So 1,000.
Wait, before you jump into that, there is one thing that I did want to cover just quickly, and there's something. It's more of a mental framework and less of like an implementation or something. But the question is, what does it actually take for health, and what does it actually take for longevity and things along those lines? And I think for most people, the threshold is not this. Like, you don't have to do all this to be healthier, achieve like certain outcomes for your health or longevity in your life. And if you look at the people who have actually lived a long time, because this guy hasn't, they are not doing this. Now, that doesn't mean that this isn't optimal. That doesn't automatically invalidate this idea. But at the same time, like, it does show you that the bar that is required to live to like a long age by current standards doesn't have to be all these crazy things that he's doing overall. And a lot of times it's really not even as in depth as what average people are doing inside the biohacking spheres. So I think it's important to understand, like, to have that frame of context, like, what is your ultimate goal? When his ultimate goal here and his preamble is discussing like pushing the boundaries of science and longevity and youth and all this type of stuff. So his goal is in a relatively lofty goal, and he's going about it in an extreme way, which fine, because that his goal is towards the extreme side and extreme relative to like the normal person. So I want to put that context here. That I don't think the argument is here is like, is this what's needed to be healthy or anything like that? I think that's not what we're talking about. It's what do we actually think about what he's doing from a contextual basis?
Got it.
Right. What do we think about this as a possible optimal strategy if you're going to throw millions of dollars at it and use all the technology? Is this the way to go? I think that's the question, right? Because as you're saying, Mike, he's not framing this as here's what the everyday man should do. He's saying, let's push those boundaries. Let's use every resource possible. And this is what you get. And what we're going to kind of get at is that I don't think that's what we would do with those sort of resources. That's not the direction we would go. And that doesn't mean that the pursuit of optimal is not a good pursuit. By all means, I mean, I think that's a great pursuit, but we don't think this is the way to do it. In most of the things, as you said, it's a mixed bag. Some things we agree with, some things we don't. So
yeah. Like living at 10,000 feet with a truckload of cherimoyas would probably be a better strategy. Okay. So by the numbers, he's eating 1,977 calories per day. He's negative 24% caloric restriction. He's a vegan, 70 pounds of veggies monthly, and he takes 100 pills per day. So what is there to learn from that?
Yeah, well, just to start, I mean, so 24% calorie restriction is a lot. Like, that is a huge percentage of calorie restriction. In most of the research, when they are doing it in rats and whatnot, I think normally the number is 20%. That's a pretty big number. And with that, to be in this case, so 24%, we're looking at a normal diet for him. He's saying is like 2,700 or whatever, 2,600. And so to be in a like 700 calorie deficit, so to speak, on a day-to-day basis and not be continually losing weight, so I mean, we can dig into rate of living theory in a second, but going through this through another avenue, if you're in a major deficit like that and you're not losing tissue, that is coming at a major cost to other organ functions. So there's Mike and I have talked about Herman Ponzer's constrained model of energy expenditure, where the assumption is that you can just create deficits and it'll just all come from your body fat. But what actually happens is then it degrades your reproductive function, it degrades your brain function, it degrades your digestive function, degrades your tissues in all sorts of ways. Like, you can't just eat less and take in less fuel and still come out with the same outcome, which is probably why he would need to use all sorts of different hormones to optimize his hormones and whatnot. And we'll dig into all that, because what he's doing in the very basic foundation is inherently damaging and not conducive to longevity or optimal function. So that's just a starting place, which I think is as bad as it can get, is a 25% calorie restriction on a day-to-day basis. And the other piece of this too is that the rate of living theory is not accurate. And it's not like in the research, it's not considered to be accurate either. I mean, we're talking about something that was built out of the view of the Industrial Revolution, where our bodies are machines and they just wear down over time. So we have to use them less to live longer. And it's no longer considered viable at all in the research. That being said, caloric restriction is still considered to be beneficial in the research. It's just not through the rate of living theory. But again, without digging into that research, the short answer is that research does not hold up at all. You have things where in C. elegans, which is one of the main organisms that's researched for caloric restriction, there's not actual legitimate extension in health span. It just goes into hibernation for an extended period of time. So it looks like improved lifespan. When it comes to rat research, you have things like caloric restriction versus ad libitum feeding, where the ad libitum rats are extremely overweight and sick and die early, and the caloric restriction doesn't actually provide benefit. I mean, just like the research behind the caloric restriction improving longevity is heavily flawed. And so I think that's already a flawed starting point that you will come to if you're in this biohacking sphere of just trying to look at the outcome without the larger perspective.
Isn't in Ansel Keys's starvation studies, isn't it
Minnesota starvation experiments?
It wasn't it like 1,700 calories that caused them to induce psychosis and like self-mutilation?
I think it was 1,800.
It was about 1,800. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that really speaks volumes about eating this little. But what were you going to say, Mike?
The other thing I was going to say is like the rat research that showed benefits that Jay already discussed as having issues with ad libitum versus restricted didn't actually play out inside the primate research. So inside the primate research, basically, if you took the primates and you like, this was monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and you put them under caloric restriction when they were younger, they actually didn't live longer. They actually died earlier than the monkeys who went into caloric restriction when they were older overall. And then there wasn't actually like a change in lifespan in monkeys who were calorically restricted on a more normal diet versus the basic lab diet. And so this brings into question, is it just restricting calories that is actually providing the benefit and the increase in lifespan? If rate of living theory isn't like the determinant, or isn't the mechanism by which caloric restriction is working to increase lifespan, and we're seeing these weird semi-paradoxical elements inside the caloric restriction research, then I think it's unlikely that just dropping calories is what's inducing the benefit or the improved lifespan for these organisms. I think it's probably not eating as much garbage, and then because a lot just to as a caveat or as a some basis here, most of the caloric restriction studies in rats and in primates use the like hottest garbage diets you can use, like sucrose, dextrose, soybean oil, corn oil, and then like Whole Foods primate diet. It was like soybean meal and corn meal and things like that. So it's not a Whole Foods diet. It's still garbage. Like it's not things that the monkeys would typically eat. So I think the question is like they just ate less garbage, so they got less sick over the course of their lifespan, and the calories wasn't a thing. And since you don't have the relationship showing in the rats with the rhesus monkeys, I think the extension from rhesus monkeys to then humans would be even more questionable as far as the implications, especially because the energetic processes in humans, I think, are a bit more demanding. Consider our central nervous system functions and whatnot. Then on top of that, there are actually problems with caloric restriction in human research. So when there's like groups of people, I think they're called the cronies, and they do caloric restriction. Basically, there's a variety of hormonal aberrations that occur, which Jay kind of touched on. So, I mean, I guess it doesn't matter if you have hormonal aberrations, if you can just plug away testosterone, DHEA, large doses of transdermal estrogen and whatnot on a regular basis. But they have like bone problems. There's some hormonal issues and things along those lines that make it questionable as if it's a good long-term strategy. It's not very clear overall. The next piece I want to mention is that his diet is probably even less calories than is shown. And the reason why I say that is because he's eating like really hard to digest foods on a regular basis in conjunction with adding something called A-carbose, which blocks carbohydrate absorption in his with his meals. So he's eating like really hard to digest grain-based or legume-based products and nuts and seeds that have components in them that inhibit digestion. And then he's taking something to further inhibit the carbohydrate ingestion. So, and then he also doesn't have a high amount of quality protein either. I mean, it's mostly plant-based protein. It seems to be balanced. I can't see the amino acid ratios, but it seems to be balanced because he tends to have like some types of nuts and seeds with the legumes, but they're not high quality protein. They're not super digestible. So the most of his diet is actually coming in from a higher fat intake. And a lot of it is actually PUFA. So it's a weird calorically restricted, borderline low carb, not so high in protein, high PUFA diet. It's like a very weird mixture for diet. And it's not entirely vegan because he uses collagen, but it's like mostly vegan. So from a perspective, there's like a lot of problems with the ideologies that are functioning here. And then I think the supplement regimen, if we dig into that, is like trying to correct for these problems. It's like he's taking iron, he's taking B12, he's taking zinc, he's taking a bunch of things to correct for the fact that his diet doesn't solve for those things. Or at least that's my assumption, right? He's not explicitly saying that. At least that's what I'm assuming based on looking at the supplement regimen.
Jay,
not to mention the testosterone, the thyroid he's using, the metformin he's using. So you've got like the hormonal replacement because his basic framework is something that is going to destroy that hormonal profile. And he's using a ton of other things that'll probably, go to lengths to keep stress hormones down to the extent that's possible, DHEA and whatnot. And then ashwagandha and things like that. But then also you've got metformin. So talking about not using the carbs that are coming in, it's a great point, Mike, that yes, he might be eating around 2,000 calories, but not absorbing a huge amount of that. Most of it's indigestible. The carbohydrates aren't going to be absorbed because of the A-carbose as well. I mean, there's just a number of things here, and we'll get into those as we get to the supplements. But yeah, do you want to go? What was the second part there, Danny, after his caloric restriction?
So measurements of blood, stool, saliva, urine, MRI, ultrasound, other, and so what would we favor in replacement of? Well, obviously a lot of these things are not accessed like everyday type of measurement, but I guess what would we favor instead of these things?
Yeah, well, so there's two things I want to mention. Also just the vegan and 70 plus pounds of veggies. I think we've got a good example here of, again, a biohacking perspective where I don't know what his ideology is behind the veganism, because as you pointed out, Mike, he has to do a lot of things to make up for the lack of nutrients there. I don't know if it's an ethical one, but regardless, obviously, I think we would say it's coming from a pretty flawed perspective. And as you said, Mike, he is still having collagen as well. But I don't think I would be considering the 70 pounds of veggies a month as a good thing. Again, we're building off of these reductionist assumptions. 100 pills daily. Again, talking about, this is something I know, Danny, you've talked about a lot. I know Ray talked about a lot. The more supplements you take, the more chance of contamination, the more chance of all sorts of issues. And we'll talk about that as we get into supplements too, but just some quick things.
Well, they're not even like the best quality supplements either. So like, I'm sure some of them have like different excipients, flow agents, whatever else in there. And then something I want to mention is like, say the theoretical idea behind doing a vegan diet was to lower certain amino acids. He's supplementing with N-acetylcysteine. So it's like, sure, maybe you lower methionine a bit, but you're still having a decent cysteine intake from supplementing essentially pure cysteine. So I think that there's a couple things that are like, and this is the part of that reductionistic element, right? So if I was to break down and say like some of the biggest problems that I see when I look at this diet, first of all, it's the veganism piece that we mentioned. So you have a bunch of hard to digest foods. For most, like his diet would bloat me up and I'd probably not feel well at all. And I know a lot of people would also have the same response. His nutrient density is okay, but considering the food matrix that he has on that food, plus the different components that inhibit absorption, I would say nutrient density isn't actually that great overall. Plus he's lacking some nutrients because he's running a largely vegan diet. The protein quality is poor. I mean, you can combine beans and grains and beans and nuts and seeds together and whatnot, and you'll get a complete amino acid profile. but it's still not the most digestible, absorbable form of protein. And they still tend to lack other sources of amino acids. Plus, he's supplementing with amino acids that were restricted in the amino acid restriction studies for longevity. So I don't even know if that was like the rationale behind that perspective. And the other thing is just like, I'm not surprised that he's doing okay on almost 2,000 calories a day, because with the amount of volume that he has in the diet, like I don't even know how you have room to eat more. Like if it's 70 pounds of veggies, what was that, a month plus what, I don't know, whatever else. I don't know if that veggies incorporates all the legumes and nuts and stuff like that. Between bloating and the amount of times that I have to go to the bathroom, I don't know if I would like want to eat more. So I think that in and of itself is problematic from the vegan perspective. The other thing I'm seeing there is like they talk about rate of living theory, and they we mentioned that, or like we were assuming that's the perspective. But what about membrane pacemaker theory, and then running like a high PUFA, high fat diet? So he's pushing fat oxidation. He's pushing higher PUFA intake. The other thing, he was also using HGH, which he had to stop due to side effects, which is further driving fat oxidation, which based on some of the things we're talking about is probably not ideal for long-term health. And the other last one is that has like non-existent sodium intake. Now, I don't know his full sodium intake because I can't see the complete chronometer, but he doesn't salt his food to taste. And then if you ever set up a whole foods diet like this, there's basically zero or very, very minimal sodium, if any at all. So there's quite a few issues with, plus I don't think the calcium intake is super high, but I know he's supplementing calcium. I just don't know what the dosage is. So those are like right off the bat, like I think those are pretty significant problems with the diet. But there is some things that he does get right? So like high quality foods, he's not using a bunch of garbage industrial foods that have a problematic components, even though the supplements likely have excipients. He does have a decent fruit intake. And then some of the vegetables are problematic, but some of them are also fine. And then some of the spices are problematic, but some of them are fine. And then as far as like fiber and polyphenolic content, I think that some of those things are actually beneficial. Maybe not 70 pounds a month, but some of it is beneficial. So there's some things right, but there's like a couple things wrong, and definitely not how I would go about using constructing my diet to live a long time, or at least to enjoy the life that I had on a regular basis.
I'm incredulous that his digestion is good. I don't believe that you can take this many pills and have good digestion. And he kind of did not, when I typed in bowel function on his website, it didn't really say anything about bowel movements. But I would guess, since we know that his body temperature is so low, that he's either horribly constipated or is having splatter diarrhea from taking these supplements. That would be my guess.
Well, not to mention the supplements, but medications like acarbose that inhibit starch absorption, you don't just like, it's not like it disappears. What that means is, so first off, the side effects for that are all digestive related, and they're massive. And it's part of like one of the biggest concerns with using it. And so first off, to consume any starchy food intentionally and then intentionally take a drug for type 2 diabetes to impair starch absorption is such an odd idea. Like, why would you ever do that? And then what happens when you don't absorb the starch is it then goes and feeds bacteria, which you don't want. You don't want massive amounts of starch heading to your colon. You want to be absorbing that. So forget all of the anti-nutrients, the starch inhibitors that are already in the nuts and seeds and grains. Forget all of the protein digesting enzyme inhibitors that are in all the nuts, seeds, and grains. You're then taking a drug to further do that. I mean, there's no way he could have any sort of comfortable or good digestion at all. It's ludicrous.
Plus metformin.
Right, which I'm sure we'll get to as well. So there was a couple other things I wanted to come back to. Something you said earlier, Mike, but I guess I'm sure it'll come back up. Do you want to go back through go to the measurements thing? I think that you were about to bring up a good point, Danny, as far as, it might be good to have some blood, stool, saliva, urine tests, but I would secondarily, I would be really careful about all the radiation-based measurements and testing, which I don't know what all he's using. You mentioned just MRI and ultrasound. But the other thing is, as you were kind of getting at, you can, a much better measure of how you're doing in many ways, or in conjunction with these, is going to be how you feel on the day-to-day basis, how your digestion is, what other symptoms are you having, where is your body temperature at? And I think, of course, we're making some assumptions here because we don't actually know how he feels day to day. Maybe he can come on and we can talk about it. But I think we're assuming that those things would not suggest that he's in an optimal state. So I think that was a great point. And I don't know if we want to go on and talk about some of the other aspects of his routine.
Well, it's really like the health and how he feels is removed from himself. It seems like it's like, I'm going to use all these markers to tell me how I feel rather than just confronting how you actually feel every day. You know,
it's a great point. And he's got, I don't know if it's like a software background or some sort of tech background. That's how he made his hundreds of millions. And it's very much that perspective, right? It's the future of medicine being AI medicine, where you just get all these tests and it reads your numbers and tells you how your health is.
Precision medicine.
It's about as far as you can get. And it's like this dystopian version of the, and I know all of us have this with our clients, where they walk into their doctor, the doctor looks at the labs and says, oh, you're fine, your thyroid's fine, whatever else. These things are optimal, just like Bryan Johnson's, but they're feeling absolutely terrible. Yeah. And they walk away feeling unheard and feeling like, obviously, this is not actually getting to what is underlying, what actually is going on physiologically. We're making all these assumptions and extrapolations. I mean, it's the perfect example of reductionism that is the exact basis for this whole blueprint.
What was Broda Barnes' quote? It's like, you can learn more about a patient with a temperature, like a thermometer, than you can with all the expensive blood tests, you know?
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about this or get into his lab work, or what do you guys want to talk about?
Well, I think the next thing would be supplements. That's like the next big area. If you go onto the left bar there, it says diet and supplements, Danny. Go all the way to the left. See how
these are just screenshots, Mike.
No,
these are just screenshots. It's not the website.
I'm on his site right now.
Oh, it is.
No, Danny's on his website.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
And then now you can see the supplements there.
Is he taking these on an empty stomach? Man,
what was that?
I'd love to know how his digestion is. Keep going.
Sorry, I remembered the thing real quick. Mike, you were talking about how maybe he was going vegan to restrict certain amino acids. He is taking he's taking some sort of amino complex that's mentioned in his diet, and that upon waking the green giant, he has an amino complex, which has things like methionine in it and tryptophan and cysteine. So if that was the reason for his veganism, as you said, it doesn't line up. And it's also, again, this product of the reductionism where, yes, we know that methionine can be an issue, but you can offset that with glycine, and you can still consume, you can consume a diet in a way that is not going to have massive amounts of methionine. And we think that you should do that. You should avoid methionine, but I don't think it's, as you're kind of getting at, or as we were saying, it's not a good reason to go vegan.
Yeah. It's also, you'd have to really restrict methionine to a heavy amount to even get that longevity benefit that you're seeing inside the rat studies anyway. So
with huge side effects.
Yes. With significant side effects overall. So I don't think a lot of some of the strategies are really tenable, especially or particularly in the long term. The other thing I wanted to come back to and just mention is like the idea of having to rely on all these tests and different components to get a sense of how you are is a continuation of the idea of constantly outsourcing everything to some type of authority figure, right? And I think that instead of taking self-responsibility and like relying on your own responses and adjusting from there, you have to give it to some sort of other system that will make the determination for you. And I think that principle alone in and of itself for a lot of people is actually directly counter to them developing their own health. Because at least for me, the best experiences that I've had in terms of improving my own health was going based off my symptoms and how I felt with something. And this is why I think we pick on the supplements so much, is like all of these supplements, I'm sure, have like 10 studies or more behind them that say it does this, it does that, it does this, it does that. And then, but the problem is like, and I'm sure you guys have seen this as well, with a client, you can give them taurine. You can say, here, take taurine, and then they can have a bunch of terrible digestive symptoms from it. And it's like, regardless of what the studies say about taurine, who cares? If you're having terrible digestive symptoms from it, then why would you take it? That's not improving the circumstance overall, unless there's some specific element why, and you can correct that. So I think that even for the average common person, setting up something simple where you can get a gauge of what are for example, for me, my digestion is one of the number one things that I deal with. So I will keep an eye on how my digestion is doing when I use certain things and then use that kind of as a gauge. So you can develop that and you don't have to get an MRI every month or you don't have to do like an ultrasound or this or that every month. Now, as far as the supplement perspective, we kind of already talked about the like fillers, excipients, flow agents, the problematic things. We talked about like using acarbose and metformin with really hard to digest carbohydrates, but he's also on high dose iodine plus the Broco Max, which is a broccoli supplement, plus genistein. Go ahead.
Why don't I launch some supplements at you guys and we can get your quick takes? So, and I'll keep things going.
Well, what I was going to say is I grouped those together because all of those things have a negative impact on thyroid function. And then he's taking thyroid. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I'm hypothyroid. He said since he's 21, fine. But it's like, I'm hypothyroid. So I'm taking thyroid, but then I'm going to take a bunch of things that are probably not that great for your thyroid. So it's like that's part of the reductionistic perspective. And I guess perhaps the idea is like, if I'm using thyroid, then it doesn't matter anymore. I don't know if that's where the idea is coming from.
Well, and he's taking estrogen and then taking testosterone. I mean, he's taking, it's all conflicting.
Well, he's taking higher dose estrogen than testosterone, right? I think it was like the testosterone was 12 milligrams a week and then the estrogen was 4 grams a week. But if you look at like estradiol or testosterone values in the body, testosterone's measured in nanograms and then estradiol is measured in picograms. So it's like, why is it's such a weird dosing regimen? It's a really high amount. And it's like, why is a man taking tons of estrogen?
Or anybody for that matter, really.
The strategy,
but especially a dude.
Yeah, the strategy here seems to be as inconsistent as possible. So these are some of the supplements that we talk about. So, I mean, does anybody have an objection to vitamin D3 at 2,000? That seems pretty safe, you know. But what about DHEA at 25 milligrams?
It's a bit high again. It can aromatize at that point and probably will, considering his diet and whatnot. Like his entire lifestyle is going to drive aromatization. So I'm assuming that would be, I mean, he's taking also fish oil with it and we'll keep going through it, but he's going to be aromatizing a decent portion of that. So that's a bit high.
We have the phytoestrogen, the genistein, plus the high dose estrogen. So, I mean, who even cares if you aromatize at that point? If you're applying topical estradiol,
maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the goal.
So he
wants more estrogen.
So we have like a thyroid inhibitor, possible thyroid inhibitor. I can't recall, but I remember somebody saying something toxic about orotate. Have you guys ever looked into that?
No, I don't know about that.
Right.
I haven't looked directly at orotate, but I mean, his dose for lithium isn't high, but lithium does have some effects on the thyroid as well.
Well, I took this exact product many, many years ago. So there was, I can't remember, some doctor was promoting it. We have like another thyroid inhibitor. I mean,
well, then it's also weird, right? Because you have metformin on there, but then you also have nicotinamide riboside. So it's like, I'm going to block some of the complexes in the mitochondria with metformin, and then I'm going to try to adjust my NAD to NADH ratio with nicotinamide riboside. Mm-hmm. Instead of just saying, I'm going to make sure that I'm oxidizing carbohydrate effectively so that I can have a better NAD plus to NADH ratio. It's like, no, we're going to increase it like strong-handedly with nicotinamide riboside. And then metformin has these benefits. So we're going to use metformin.
Well, that's the ridiculousness of it all, right? So metformin was shown, just like caloric restriction in some of these studies, to extend lifespan. And so then it's like, oh, well, yeah, of course, I'll just take metformin, forget the fact that it's just going to fully impair carboxylation and, cause lactic acid production and essentially prevent ATP production from glucose, not to mention all the other plethora of issues that it has. I mean, it's again, just I don't think you can do it in a more reductionist way.
Yeah.
And people, and even in the biohacking sphere, I mean, I know Dave Asprey used to talk positively about metformin. I think Ben Greenfield did too. They don't take it anymore because of its like direct mitochondrial toxicity, impairment of the electron transport chain, those kinds of things. So
plus metformin has a side effect of like wrecking your gut when you first start taking it. Like it will make you run to the bathroom, which is why like acarbose plus metformin plus all of these things, like I couldn't imagine this not causing some type of discomfort, plus eating like a ridiculous amounts of beans and nuts.
Yeah, metformin went the way of Rob Wolf's fish oil calculator. I think people realized that it was damaging, so they stopped doing it. But the funny thing about the health world is stuff will come back into vogue later. So maybe in 8 months or something, a lot of these same people will start talking about metformin again. So what else? What else is there to dissect from his supplement regimen?
Well, he's taking fish oil. No surprise there.
We kind of talked about the N-acetylcysteine.
Some of this stuff.
Well, that's the other thing is like it's like this is the whole thing that's also questionable to me. I want to improve my NAD to NADH ratio, so I'm going to go on a low carbohydrate diet and then plug HGH. It's like, so you're going to push fat oxidation and then further push fat oxidation. It's like, how is that improving your NAD plus NADH ratio from like an overall picture? It's like, it's not. So you're going to slam nicotinamide riboside. Fine. I mean, if you want to like have to do it that way, then this doesn't make any sense. Like if you actually go into and understand what's going on in the mitochondria, it's like that really doesn't make that much sense at all.
And just for the people that don't know, the NAD to NADH ratio reflects the amount of electrons that are being passed to oxygen, reflecting like proper mitochondrial respiration, correct?
Right. Yeah. And it's a good NAD to NADH ratio, or a high NAD to NADH ratio, is associated with health, and a low one is associated with every disease process. So and nobody, you have this.
Nobody disagrees with that, right? Have you talked to anybody in the health world? Everybody's obsessed with NAD, right?
Well, so some of the people, so the informed people in the low carb space, like Peter from Hyperlipid, is like, they actually understand that a low carb diet is going to reduce that ratio, and they then make the argument that that's good because it's along the lines of rate of living theory, benefits of reactive oxygen species production, things like that. Like that's the perspective, is all of the things that are essentially damaging and stressful are good, and that's because normally it comes back to hormesis. That's the only thing that actually it at least makes a little bit more sense than the average low carb fasting person who just says sugar is toxic and increases stress hormones, and low carb increases your mitochondrial respiration and improves mitochondrial function. Like, the people spouting that have no concept of the physiology at all. And they are just spitting out talking points that most people believe because people say it, but are not at all based in physiology.
Yeah, I'm going to debunk what I just said, because keto acids are good medicine by Veach. Like, that's a famous kind of low carb paper. And
that argues for NADH, like having a higher amount of reductive equivalence or a higher NADH.
Yeah, and he says that beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone, which is elevated in ketosis, matches the NADH production. So
Veach's papers are great. I talked about him with Dom, because Veach talks about how terrible low carb diets and ketogenic diets are for mitochondrial function, and he didn't recommend it because of that, and instead recommended just using ketones to try to get some of the benefits without those negatives. Got it.
Okay, so what else is there to wrap up? Like he's taking a pretty high ratio of T4 to T3. So like this is a 9, about 40. So 150 to 10. Is that right? So
probably, 15, and he's got no 1. Conversion of T4 to T3 going on.
So 15 to 1 ratio of T4 to T3, which is crazy. Dude, man, again, I'm not trying to project onto him, but like I take I've taken a 5 to 1 and felt like basically super dumb. Like I couldn't even express what I was feeling at a dinner conversation. I remember one time, but that's pretty wild. The 17 alpha estrogen, 4 grams per week transdermal, testosterone 2. Say it again, Mike.
Nothing. I'm just laughing because it's such a ridiculous dose. I haven't seen, even for women, I haven't seen a 4 gram per dose week so far.
Yeah, that is definitely odd that he's taking so much.
Maybe that's maybe that's written incorrectly, 4 grams.
You know what it could be? He might tend toward, again, I'm speculating hard, but he might tend towards fatigue. And so if he was taking estrogen, that might feel like an upper to him, and it might allow him to get everything that he needs to do done every day. But that's hard to justify. That's pretty crazy.
He is using aspirin. That's nice.
Will the 81 milligrams of aspirin protect him?
He's on aspirin, thyroid, taurine, DHEA, testosterone, D3, K2. I think those are okay.
Yeah. And you see the reflections of all these things in his lab work too. Like his HDL is super high at 73, which is normally a pretty good sign of estrogenic status.
His SHBG was crazy high. And
also probably driven by estrogen.
Yeah. Low carb, high fiber, high fat diet.
Yeah.
But the
other thing too is I feel like a lot of people will see how lean he is and they'll automatically assume that means you're healthy. But I don't actually think that being that lean is healthy in the long run. I talked about this on what was it? On the Thermo Diet podcast. I was talking about after a certain point, leanness is actually not a good thing for both men and women. And even so, body fat percentage and also BMI, if it gets too low, there are like negative associations with health with that. And I remember when we were in college, Jay, and we were both like super lean, doing low carb and intermittent fasting and working out, like both of us were not feeling that great overall in multiple areas, hormonally, sleep wise, energy wise, workout progress, all these different types of things. So I feel like, I don't know. I think that people assume that extreme leanness like that is a good thing. Now, being overweight I'm not making an argument, because I think a lot of people automatically go to this to say, oh, you should just be overweight. What the argument I'm more pushing for is like, there's a optimal body fat level, or there's like around a normal level that's appropriate. And I think he's way far on the other side. I think that's another problem here. I remember when I was that lean, I have vivid memories of having really bad sleep and not feeling well. I also have vivid memories of trying a diet set up similar to this in the plant-based phase before I even got to the paleo stuff, and having like a really bad time and really bad mood and energy and like relationships, and everything was suffering and digestively.
Did that lead to your gallbladder surgery?
That actually was what led to my gallbladder surgery. Was I went on like a super plant-based diet. It was like lentils and raw arugula and raw garlic and avocado and like olive oil dressing with lemon I would make. And I would eat that and then like vinegar, and I eat that 3 times a day.
Sounds good.
And I felt terrible. I remember I went to the cardiologist when I was eating that type of diet. I was very lean at that point as well. And my heart rate was like resting was like 38 to 40 beats per minute. And I remember the cardiologist like commenting to me, he's like, wow, it's like, you're so healthy. You must be like quite an athlete. And I just remember like I was freezing cold. My workouts were terrible. I was also juicing kale. And then that's when I wound up developing that's when I developed the gallbladder problems. Or it was, I don't even know if it was gallbladder, but serious digestive issues. And then the surgeon was just like, oh, it's probably your gallbladder. Let's take it out.
Yeah, just from a quick glance, his cholesterol seems low. His DHA, despite taking it, seems low. His SHBG, like we talked about, seems high.
Farther down, Danny, he mentions different markers, different values, where his total cholesterol is 128. 128,
yeah, I saw that, but I didn't read it fully, so I didn't know that. I mean, that's really low. You know, that's like endotoxemia, or your liver is not functioning right low. That's crazy.
Yeah.
They're all optimal though. I have to take his word for it.
Well, lower is better. There's no negative, just lower and lower cholesterol.
I honestly think this would be like hypocholesteremia. Like this would be, I mean, Mike, this is like well under the range. But
actually, the way they do the ranges now is just less than 200 is good.
Yeah, got it.
And then if you have heart disease, some cardiologists will even push for lower, like as low as possible. Some of them think is like the best way to go. Total.
Yeah, I know people who are put on statins for heart disease who have cholesterol in the 120s and have signs of muscle damage and all sorts of issues. And the doctors do not want to lower the dose on the statins or anything. They're so against that.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. It's quite an interesting, that's the other thing is like, who's defining what's optimal? Who's defining these ranges? That's also really important because the other thing is like, so say you're going to plug in your information into some like super AI system, like lab analyzer. And then it's just like, there's this range and your labs are optimally in this range. Are you looking at that in the context of everything else? Are you looking at like your symptoms with the labs, with what's going on with your diet, connecting the different dots all together, trying to figure out what's causing what, why you're in this particular way or experiencing that? and like understanding the relationships between each thing. And I doubt, it doesn't seem like that's the case. It's like, oh, this is the optimal value, or optimal value. Like this study says that this lab value is associated with X. So we just want to be less than this particular lab value. And then it's like, once we're there, okay, that's optimal. I don't know if that's how they're going about it, but it seems based on how everything else is running, the level of reductionism, that it's probably something like that. And I would argue that that's largely not ideal, especially because I wouldn't characterize many of those lab values as optimal. I mean, obviously that's what you guys are saying as well.
Yeah. And it's based on research that requires interpretation if you want to actually get it right. I mean, in the same way that we can talk metformin, calorie restriction, anything else, the lab value ranges that are determined are based on often reductionist assumptions and correlations and things like that. And, you know, I think all of us have talked about issues with low cholesterol levels in the past. I mean, that is the territory that you fall into when you are just taking these endpoints and looking at health as a computer program. And you just, you know, these studies just prove that this is the right formula, and you just do everything you can to create that formula. I mean, I think this is all to be expected when that happens.